Hello, my name is Maritza Munzon. I work at College of the Canyons in the International Services and Programs Department. Thank you so much for tuning in. And today we'll be talking about guest etiquette. And really, it's all about knowing how to behave in social situations in the United States. To start, we'll go over a brief history of manners in Western culture, since US culture is very much linked to Western civilization and development of that civilization. So, and it's after the brief history, we'll go over different kinds of guests and what rules and manners kind of revolve around those situations. One is when you are an overnight guest in someone's house. Second is when you're invited over as a dinner guest. And third, if you're invited to a party and how to behave in those situations. So let's start. Brief history of manners in Western culture. So, in a nutshell, this has been an ongoing search for the best way to be kind. And of course, we've had quite a long history in human civilization, so that's changing. We're going to look primarily at Western culture because the US really developed out of Western culture. So, to start, 16,000 BC. This is when we are primitive humans. This is where primitive humans really didn't do manners. This is where we started zero as far as like human development and the idea of manners. But this idea of manners and how to be courteous and how to be kind, like we said earlier, is something that develops over time. And if you see in the picture, we see primitive humans that are living in caves. So this co-living, what does that really mean when you're co-living in this cave-like environment? It's like you do everything in front of everyone. So there's really no shield or rules around what can be done in front of people. People ate in front of each other, slept, went to the bathroom, made and delivered babies in front of each other in this environment. There was also the killing and maybe sometimes eating of your enemies at this time. So there's a lot of things that just you're very in tune with nature, and the instinct is to survive. It's not necessarily to be kind at this point. So when did things change? Let's start or fast forward a little bit to 20 AC in Rome. And this is part of the ancient civilization of Western culture. So this is really a time where you see recordings of rules in civilization, how to act in social settings. And this is really seen kind of at the wealthy level, people that are more affluent. So some of the things you see is that you want to tame that nature within. And this is where the people start separating themselves from others. So you want to make sure that you seem like you're wealthy, you're refined, you're better than others in Rome. So what are the things that separate you from people that are not civilized at this time? And that is one, civilized people take a bath at least once a week. They will start removing nasal hair. So this was seen as something as you're unkept. You're not presenting yourself well if you had nasal hairs. People started brushing their teeth. Now, of course, at that time, people didn't brush their teeth in the same way that we do now. So they might end up using, I think it was crushed shells as toothpaste or other things that we wouldn't use now. But there's still the idea of brushing your teeth and the idea of having to upkeep oral hygiene was something that started developing around this time. The other thing is like we started policing how men behave towards women. So this was seen as, you can't just be violent towards women. You can't do X, Y, and Z towards women. So it was like, how do you behave with other people within your culture, but also how do you behave with different genders? And the final is good personal appearance and cleanliness. And so this goes back to like brushing your hair, removing nasal hair. So you wanted to have a pretty good appearance of maintain a good appearance and how you dress, how you look, how you smell. And the thing that they were trying to separate themselves from was from the Barbaria people, that they would say, or Northern Europe. So this is more the Germanic civilizations and the Celtic civilizations. But at this time, they were still more of a tribal culture. So they wanted to separate themselves from that and say, like, we are more civilized than those people. Now, next, let's fast forward a little bit more. Like I said, this is going to be a brief history of manners. We're going to go into like key points in history where you see that the rules of manners start to change. And in 1909 in London, England, we see the Book of the Civilized Man. So what is this? This is really a poem that's written in Latin, and it explains how to act with courtesy and courium in social situations. And so the interesting thing is, even though it's a poem and it's written, but it's not necessarily rules, but it is a written form of how to behave in public, how to behave around other people. So some examples they give is, let's say you have to belch, you have to burp. But it doesn't say not to do it, it says do it up to the ceiling. It also says, do not attack your enemies while you are in the bathroom. Don't mount your horse in the hallways. Don't bring animals into the hall and mount them. And one of those things, don't poke your nose. This one, when you start seeing it, don't poke your nose in public. It's not okay. So this is something that's interesting, and we start to see that in written form more and more and more. Next, we move to 1450s Venice, Italy. So the Venetian glass goblet or flute. So now you see similar glasses nowadays when if you go out to eat dinner in a nice place, you might get a fancy glass. If you have champagne or wine, you get them in these glasses that are pretty delicate. And so this is the age of delicacy, or the age of delicate. Fragile glassware becomes very popular in Europe, particularly in Venice and in Italy. They're seen as like the cradle of civilization at this point. And what is the point of this class? So if you think about civilization up until a point, people are maybe want things that are durable, they're develop things that are sturdy, but then this comes out, and what this says is that you need to be careful, and it's a way to force people to use their fingers in a very delicate way when they are drinking, whether it be water, wine, or whatever it was that they were drinking out of these goblets. And this was a way to teach moderation. Some that moderation is admirable, but it is also something that is elegant. It's a way to teach being careful. And it's also showing that being careful is glamorous and exciting, because not only is this glass delicate, but it is decorated in a very lovely way. And so this is something that was to draw people into being glamorous and to be fragile and to be moderate. So you're not just taking things too fast. You get to enjoy them. This one we see out of Venice, Italy in the 1450s. So next we move into France in the 1533. So France started developing this cutlery. So this you'll see a lot still. We use these different forks for different situations in the United States. And this is Catherine de Medici marries Henry II of France, and she brings forks from Florence. And Florence is the epicenter of culture at this time. So what does this change? Is like it changes the rituals around how we eat dinner. And this you'll see will be important a little bit later, but it's like you see different people eat different ways around the world, and there's different ways you can eat different types of meals. But by the 16th century, there was no European court that didn't have a set of forks, and this kind of became the rules of high society in a way. It changed it, like I said, it changed the ritual of eating. So instead of using your hands to eat in European courts, you started using this cutlery. So you were distinguished from the quote unquote savages. Like if you're using your hands to eat, then you were one of the quote unquote savages. So that's why in the court, they started having these forks and the knives that came into play when you're eating, so that you don't get your hands dirty. Okay, next. So now we get to the US. We've been in Europe. We went through ancient civilization. We went through the different types of manners, how to behave with one another, how to behave in public. And then we also just saw how things started to change as far as like how you eat. Now, when the United States, or fast forward to United States in 1827 in New York. So that's what they called democratic manners. So during this time, there was a French aristocrat who was starting to tour the new nation that, which is the United States, and what their take on manners was, or what he perceived as having not manners. So in the United States, no one took off their hat to anyone. There was no real difference in greeting depending on the class. You couldn't really tell by the way people were dressed if they lived in a mansion or if they lived in a hut. And so this was, for the French aristocrat, kind of confusing at first. He said, at least one of the things that European manners established at this time was a hierarchy. So if you were at the bottom, then you had to speak to people at different social levels at different ways. So there's different ways of dress, different ways of greetings, different ways of how to interact with one another, depending on what level of society you were at. Though in the United States, this called democratic manners kind of erased that. It was like it gave everyone seemingly a even playing field where, and I think this is still very much part of today, where you might hear like, hey, how are you doing? How's it going? From someone randomly in the street that you don't know. So this is something that you still see. And of course, especially in California, where our college is located, it's called, we have kind of a laid back attitude towards either like manners and dress. So if someone's wearing a t-shirt and jeans, you really don't know if that person lives in a mansion or if they live in an apartment. So there is that sense of like, you by looking at someone, you really don't know what their social economic status is. So back to 1827, it's like this new US, there was really no difference between people, so casual manners. And one of the things that the French aristocrat said was uh, that these casual manners didn't do away with class. It was just a way to kind of hide it. So that was one of the critiques of these democratic manners at the time. And I think that's still could be a critique today, except that I think that these democratic manners are more common all over, not over the US, but also generally in Western civilization. That's also expanding a little bit. Okay, so now let's get into how to be a good guest, and kind of some of the things you should take note of when you're invited for these super situations. And we'll start with overnight guests. So let's say someone invites you over to their house and you're able to spend the night. This might happen if you're visiting someone in a different city, for example. I know when I've traveled and I've traveled within the California and the United States, sometimes like you have friends in different areas and they'll allow you to spend the night in their place instead of staying in a hotel, which could be very nice. It saves you some money when you're traveling and trying to explore. So one of the things you should be careful of, or at least take note of, is be clear on how long you're going to stay with that friend. You want to make sure that you don't show up unannounced, so you let them know beforehand when you're coming and how long you're going to stay, so that they understand what the situation is. And one of the things that you shouldn't do is don't show up with pets, children, or significant other, or maybe even other friends if you're traveling with more than one person, unless you make sure it's okay with your host. Like, of course, if you have pets, children, or someone else that you're traveling with, then that's not a problem. But you just have to make sure your host knows how many people are staying and how long, so that they agree with the situation. And it's always nice to bring a gift. It doesn't have to be something extravagant. So I know when I visited family or friends abroad, I've always brought either some chocolates, or if my friends are into wine, maybe a bottle of wine. So it's just nice to show up with something in hand. Also, flowers are always good too. Just so you know, there's some suggestions, but you're not limited to any of those. Okay, so moving on. So we're still an overnight guest, and it's important to follow house rules. So, and this, how do you figure out house rules? Of course, people don't have their house rules listed out somewhere where it's visible. So the best thing to do is once you arrive, ask some questions. One is, what time does everyone usually wake up? What time does everyone go to bed? So once you know this, you kind of know the rhythm of the house, when you should be waking up, and also when you should be kind of winding down and letting people go to bed when they usually do. Of course, if there's anything you need to know about kids or if they have pets, some people don't like it when you feed their pets human food, only pet food. So it's something to know right when you get in, so you don't accidentally do something with their kids or the pets that they are not going to like. And of course, you should leave the thermostat alone. In the US, a lot of housing will have a thermostat, so it controls the central air, so cooling and heating in the house. And each family will usually set it to whatever temperature they prefer. So it's always best to just keep that alone. Limit your phone use. Of course, this is I think less and less in the US. There's people that actually have a landline. I know my parents still have a phone in their house, but most people now carry their phone with them. So this is probably less likely, or you'll probably end up encountering this less so. But if they do have a phone and you want to use it, then I think you should always ask. And of course, don't use it too much. And one of the best advice I can give you is be extremely helpful. If you're staying over at someone's house, then you want to make sure you clean up after yourself and you help around a little bit. Like if you're eating meals with the family, if you're is it like eating meals with the family, you want to make sure you're helping either prepare or clean up afterwards. So some of the things that you just want to make sure you're tidy. And of course, last thing is be self-sufficient. Just because you're in town, it doesn't mean, or you're staying the night in their house, doesn't mean that the host will or can drop everything just because you're going to stay. Sometimes they're happy to have you at their house, but they might still have to go to work, might still have to, pick up kids or do other things around. They have their own schedule to follow. So it is unexpected that the host will be able to drop everything just to hang out with you. But if they can, then of course they probably will do hang out with you and show you around. Um, but just as I said, try to not expect it and have your own plans and try not to get in the way of other people's plans or your hostess plans. And so just with those basic things, announce when you're coming, don't overstay your welcome, be very, very helpful, and bring a gift. And I think if you follow those simple rules, then you'll be just fine. Next, if you're invited to dinner, I think this will be more often the case than overnight guests, but people, at least I love having people over for dinner. So one of the things you should do, and I think you'll notice that some of these social rules and etiquette will kind of overlap. But so first thing is bring a little gift. So if someone invites you to dinner, especially like I said before, chocolates, maybe a wine, a dessert, some kind of appetizer, or even flowers. If you don't like cooking or don't cook, then it's always nice to bring a little something to the people that invited you over. And say, don't show up early or stay too late. If you're invited to a dinner party at 7, then please arrive at 7 or shortly afterwards. And the US is very punctual. It's one of those countries that like to be on time. So if they tell you, oh, we're having dinner from 7 to 9, then expect to arrive around probably around 7, and then anything to wind down and head home around 9 o'clock. Again, the same thing as before. It's like offer to help. If you can help, if you get up, maybe arrive a little bit early, then it's not too bad, like maybe 10 minutes or so, then you can help maybe set the table, or when dinner's done, you can help clear the table. If you're there early enough to be at the prep part of dinner, then you can help wash vegetables or chop vegetables. And of course, at the end, you should always try to offer to wash dishes. A lot of times, people will have a dishwasher, so it's more like loading the dishwasher, not actually washing them. And even then, that's the case, then you should always offer to wash dishes. Most hosts will say no, thank you, but it's always nice to have that offer. And of course, when you are at dinner, that's one of the things that make conversation. If you're invited over, then people want to hang out with you, people want to talk to you. So you should be careful on make sure you're asking appropriate questions and that you are listening and being engaging in a conversation. Questions always shouldn't be too personal, but keep things light, and any answers you give, it's like be informative, but you don't have to go into a dissertation, for example, like a long, drawn out answer. So, and of course, depending on how long you've known your dinner guests, then conversations will change. But this is more advice for if it's someone you don't know very well. So it's always good to yes, ask questions and get to know them, but don't make them too personal. And once you're asked questions, try not to take over the whole conversation and go into too much detail. But I'll leave that, guys, up to you into how much detail, and it'll change from person to person. So, all right, next, let's talk about getting invited to a party. This will probably be the most common kind of situation you get into, especially if you are studying in the US for a while. And you'll, of course, make some friends, and eventually you'll get invited to a party, probably more. So let's talk a little bit about how to be a courteous guest. First thing is tell your host whether you're attending or not. This is important more for the hosts, so they know how many people are coming. They can plan better as far as like how much food and drink to have for their guests and to buy beforehand. Next, like we talked about before, is make sure to be on time. Punctuality can mean different things to different people, but in general, you should arrive whenever the host tells you to, or maybe like 10, 15 minutes in between that time. So whatever stated in your invitation or whatever the host tells you. But just so you know, if you said that the party starts at 5, then make sure to be there either 10 to 15 minutes before, 10 to 15 minutes after 5. So just to be safe. Be willing to participate. This is probably one of the most important things when you're invited to a party. It's like, I know there are people, I'm one of them, that is a little introverted, and you tend to like to keep to yourself. But if you're invited to a party, it's a good way to get to know other people. Just make sure that you are able to mingle, say hello to people, introduce yourself if you don't know someone. And of course, if there are games, try to participate in the games as well. Now, we saw this before as well, offer to help whenever you can. Even if your offer is refused, it is always really appreciated. And especially towards the end of the party, I think this is when hosts will need the most help. If you offer to clean up, then I think it's important to show your guests that you appreciate the invitation and you're willing to help clean up, so they don't have to do all the work. Next is don't overindulge. So this is important because especially with food and drink, you just want to make sure that if it's there, then of course it's free to take and to eat and drink whatever is around. But just to make sure if you do it moderately so that there's enough for everyone. It's basically, you want to make sure that you're not taking more than your fair share when there are other people there in the party. Next is don't stay too long. So I know that sometimes we get caught up and we are having a good time, but Look for signs that your host is getting tired or maybe bored or people are starting to leave. Then that's a good sign to be like, okay, if people are starting to leave, then I should also try to wrap things up and head home. And of course, there's always good to thank your host. At least do it twice. Thanking your host enthusiastically, just saying your goodbyes. And after the event's done, so the first time you say thank you would be at the party you're leaving. Thank you for inviting me. This was really fun. Blah blah blah. Like you want to make sure they thank them there. But then afterwards, after the party's done, a second thank you is always good. Either the next day, a phone call, a text, or some people still send thank you cards. So that's always also nice to see from, or as a party host, it's also nice to get that kind of second uh, thank you notice and saying that the party was appreciated. So it's also more likely that they'll invite you back to another party. So to wrap up, what is etiquette? Etiquette relates to the code of behavior among people within an organization, group, or society. And this is what we've talked about during this whole presentation, and the evolution of manners and the evolution of just etiquette and how to behave in different social situations. And of course, we started off with cavemen who didn't have any manners. It was just everyone did everything in front of each other. The Romans, when they started brushing their teeth. The Venetians with their fancy glasses that taught people how to be fancy, delicate, and to do things in moderation. We went over to France, where they started eating things with forks and knives instead of using their hands. And then, of course, in the United States, where we had the democratic manners. So there's not that sense of division among socioeconomic status. Now, all of this, of course, all of this history is embedded into our manners now in the United States. And I think as a rule of thumb, whether you're invited to a party, to a dinner, or as an overnight guest, a couple of things to keep in mind is be on time, let your host know whether you're coming or not, and if you're staying, how long you're going to stay. And finally, always offer to help. It's always very important. Always offer to help and thank your guest and thank them one and once. So with that, I'll end. And I do want to share just a slide on some resources that I looked up. The history of manners. It was a very good video from TED Ed. And these are a couple other articles that I took on tips and tricks on how to be a good guest for your host. And finally, I wanted to thank you for watching and want to give you our contact information. So you can always email us with questions at isp@canyons.edu. You can look us up online. And of course, please follow us on social media. We have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. They're all great ways to find out what we're doing and to catch other webinars or presentations like this. All right, thank you.